text and his wider, if you like, propositions. He's an intriguing character as a public intellectual because he brings two things together, and these are incredibly rare. One, he is a genuine intellectual who changes the landscape of thinking about economics. There's no doubt about that. I think sometimes claims for this text are slightly overstated, but not wholly overstated. It changes the climate of opinion that Milton Friedman's injection of a particular argument. Secondly, this is really worth thinking about when you're looking at public intellectuals. He was able to popularize them. I've spent the last 30 years of my life in the ideas industry, especially around economics, to some degree around political economy. Generally speaking, those people who make breakthroughs in economics or in political theory are the dullest men and women you could ever listen to. They can write, they can theorize, but they can't popularize. Milton Friedman was possibly a populist. I'll come back to that in a moment, Hal, but was able, by what I mean by that, was able to be on talk TV shows, the equivalent thereof, in the 1980s, and explain his concepts in an incredibly accessible fashion. My other great intellectual heroes, Friedrich Hayek, less so. Ludwig von Mises, we don't know so much about. But this is an incredible man who was able not just to write a text that I think matters, but was able to bring it to life through the medium of television, principally. If you go to YouTube and you type in Milton Friedman, you will get great content from the man himself. Not quite as erudite as Thomas Sowell, not quite so many good one-liners, but not far off. This is a Nobel Prize winner who was able to bring economic concepts to the masses. Virtually nobody else has done that in the 100 years or so of economics as a social science. An incredible impact, really. The brains and the mouth as one. I think the most important chapter of this book is the first one about democracy and capitalism, which for Americans might just automatically go arm in arm. We're a democratic society and a capitalist society, and we just see this as having a left arm and a right arm. Friedman's insight here, I think, is of colossal importance, not just at the time, and in fact wasn't of great importance at the time, is possibly of even greater importance now in 2025, that if you're minded to think about human freedom in two spheres, the economics, how much of your money do you keep from your labor, how much do you have to give to the government, are industries nationalized or are they privatized? If you see that as the, if you like, the left half of the brain or the left arm, and political freedoms being rather different, they're on the right arm. So whatever I'm paying in tax, perhaps I have freedom of speech. Whether the industry I'm working for is nationalized, perhaps I have freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Now, generally speaking, the approach until this great book was these are two different concepts and we can measure them differently. That how economically free a society is entirely distinct from how politically free a society is. I guess to take a look at a society that you might say is economically unfree, broadly speaking, in the 60s or 70s might be, say, Scandinavia. Vast amounts are collected in taxation. The state runs practically everything. But you do apparently have freedom of speech and freedom of conscience and all of those sort of Western tropes of freedom. Milton Friedman suggests, and I think has been proven correct, despite my Scandinavian counterexample, that actually economic freedom is a prerequisite for political freedom. These are not the left arm and the right arm, they're the heart and the lungs. So if you don't have economic freedom, if the state is in charge of production, control, delivery and supply and demand, then you will surely lose your freedom to speak out, possibly by legislation and diktat, but certainly as a practical issue. If you are dependent on the state for the delivery of things that you are looking for, let's take the basics: food, water, housing, heating, all of those things. Then if the state is in control of those things and you are a purchaser or at least a recipient of those things, then political freedom will not exist. It will die on the vine. It can't exist. So actually he suggests rather radically that economic freedom is a prerequisite of political freedom. That you could dream of a world like the Soviet Union in which there's plenty of stuff for all, we'll organize your life, don't worry, the bread and the water will come to your homes, the Politburo has worked it all out, we will make sure that no man or woman is left behind, and that political freedoms can flourish. That possibly was even the dream of the early communists. But once production and control is actually in the hands of the state, the civilian population loses its political freedom. This is quite a radical insight, and one that I think we need to revisit now, that economic freedom is a prerequisite. It's not a guarantee, but it's a prerequisite to political freedom. Without economic freedom, if the state you live in is in control of the basic necessities under political control run by a Politburo or something similar, then in reality, you're not going to have political freedoms or freedom of speech. And to bring that right up to date, I would say that's quite a problem that we're facing in the West now, that the erosion of our freedoms, cancel culture and the like, what you can say, whether you'll be sent to prison for saying something untoward on social media, is a reflection that too many of the things that we rely on and have to interact with are part of the state. This is one hell of an insight by Friedman, and I think he is correct on it. There are a number of other things in which I think he works out how we should segue from the world we're in now to a world that would be better. He's clearly part of what's called the Chicago School of conservative or libertarian thinking, distinct from the Austrian school of libertarian or neoliberal thinking. And again, I should say for the Americans, we are two nations divided by the same language. Liberal means something really rather different over here to what it means over there. He is accepting some of the paradigms of the welfare state from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, from Clement Attlee, that universal provision of some services are a necessity. But, and again, I think this is an important insight and probably where we're going to move to some many years after this book was published. Even if you believe, which Milton Friedman does, and I think I probably do too, that education, chapter 6 of this book, is in essence a basic human right, that if we don't educate the citizenry of a country, if people are not numerate and literate, and now possibly much better than that, able to think about AI and engineering, then society will fail. So citizens need to be educated. It's not just a product about whether you want McDonald's or pizza or curry this evening to eat. It's something that needs to be provided. So he buys into a kind of universal, you might say, welfarist provision. All citizens must have this education. He only spends a sentence or two, so almost a throwaway line. We all agree that education should be provided for all citizens. You might want to contest that if you're an ultra-libertarian, but let's go with that premise. Here is his insight in this book that has not been widely adopted. It has been adopted in a couple of places. Interestingly, going back to Scandinavia, Sweden was one of the places that adopted it. I believe Estonia was another. Let's say you need universal provision of a given service, education, food, water, housing, for example. That does not mean that the state needs to be the provider of the service. They need merely to be the insurer, the underwriter of the service. So if you're to look at, say, Britain today, there's a general acceptance that everybody in Britain should have access to food. But that's not a reason to nationalize supermarkets. The provision of that food can be provided by a whole mixture of grocers. We want competition between them. And you might get, if you are fallen in a bad way, a food voucher. But that's not exactly how we do it in the UK. The US is more like that. Now, he suggests education vouchers, that education should indeed be underwritten by the state, but the provision of it should be an open market. And I think that although he didn't really make much progress on this point, other than in one or two areas, a little bit in America, certainly in Sweden, certainly in Estonia, this is a thought, an idea whose time is coming. That if we're willing to buy in to certain provisions are guaranteed for the population, education, health in the UK is almost entirely nationalised, housing potentially, social housing, public sector housing has gone down, but whatever your ream of things that you want to guarantee to the population, whether they are zero, Dickensian workhouse, you just stand on your own 2 feet or die, or whether they're generous and we say every single civilian will get education till they're 18, housing till they die, healthcare from cradle to grave. Pick wherever you are at on that spectrum, and we don't need to even begin to disagree about it. The question would be, how should that be provided? So let's say we underwrite the guarantee of education. That's what Friedman concentrates on in chapter 6. Why would that actually be organized and provided by the state rather than merely guaranteed by the state? So why shouldn't schools be like grocers and supermarkets? And then we could have education vouchers rather than food, equivalent to food vouchers, rather than you are enrolled in a particular school. Put another way around, if I can stretch this analogy a little bit further, imagine rather than you guys having a choice about whether you go to Asda or Tesco or Waitrose or the local corner store to get your bread, milk and groceries, supposing you were just assigned to one, that we've decided in the postcode area you're in, your local grocery provider is Tesco's 1.5 miles away. You must get your groceries from Tesco's. How do you think that would work out? What sort of service do you think you would then get from Tesco? You are a captured audience by Tesco. You have been assigned to them as a customer. You might find a way around it, as we do in the state school education in Britain. You might move house, or you might pretend that you live somewhere else, so you're closer to, say, a Waitrose, which you might consider as a better provider. But we wouldn't have competition. The vouchers idea, I think, is a genius by Friedman to say it doesn't matter how welfarist you wish to be, from zero to incredibly Scandinavian generous, the provision of it should not be by the state, even if the underwriting is. And I think that idea is about to kick in, certainly in Britain, on things like healthcare and education. There's a kickback against it from the present government, but not much of one. The next idea, and I suspect, again, this is an idea that is accurate at the time, but he made no headway on, but now might be about to find a lot, is around licensing of professions. What qualifies you to be a heart surgeon or an architect or a lawyer or a therapist or a hairdresser?
Or an engineer.
Or an engineer. What qualifies you for this? And on licensing, he is against it. You may well want to have a kite mark. you may well want to say, well, here is my CV, here is the proof points I've got. I can remember, it's now all done by TripAdvisor, but one of the things I loved as a boy was that hotels in Britain were rated by the AA and the RAC. Not the hotel industry. These were private automobile clubs that would issue stars to various hotels on the grounds of their cleanliness, the quality of service, the comfort of the rooms, was issued by a private enterprise. We are now in danger of moving into, if you want to run a hotel, you must have a certification saying that you are a hotel manager who has done 2 years of hotel management at Brighton University or such like. Licensing is a restricted practice. This is quite complex because you can imagine the scare stories that, I don't know, you've got something that needs to be removed from your brain. You are probably going to want a brain surgeon to remove this delicately from your brain. And you are probably going to want to make sure that that brain surgeon knows what the hell they're doing, that they're not just a maniac with a toolkit who's going to saw through your skull and then try and pluck it out with a pair of tweezers. So people are instinctively, oh my God, if the problem is difficult and technical, I want to know that somebody is licensed to do it. Otherwise, am I going to be done by pranksters or frauds? What Friedman points out, and I think this is becoming more and more evidentially true, is licensing is actually just a restricted practice. And in an open market, you would find the people who have got 4 or 5 stars very, very quickly. A bit like my AARAC hotel thing, which has now been overtaken by TripAdvisor. If you're running a hotel on TripAdvisor, which is continually getting reviews saying the blankets were stained, the food was disastrous, the toilet didn't flush, you're going to go out of business very quickly. So the market is giving that feedback mechanism. But even in 1962, Friedman had correctly predicted this is a restricted practice. This is definitely true of the medical and the legal profession in the United Kingdom. If you are facing a court case in the UK, I would probably recommend to you that you should hire a licensed solicitor or a licensed barrister. But I don't think you should have to. I don't think your other option should be to represent yourself. You might want to hire me. I got halfway through my law degree and gave up. I think I should be able to compete with those professions. I won't be able to give you the 5-star AA or RAC review, but that will go to price and trust. Licensing is a racket. There's one other area of the book, and this is what I think I wanted to, if you like, finish on, where I think Friedman might be too keen to embrace a second best option. And that's on money and who controls money and the money supply. And I mentioned how at the top of the show, 2 sort of major schools of thought in the 20th century on the conservative neoliberal side, Chicago economics and Austrian. And I'm going to confess I'm a bit more of an Austrian. However, if you're going to have a state-controlled money supply, I think Milton Friedman gives you some good grounds on how to organize it. You should just control the money supply. He suggests in the chapter on money that the only job of the Federal Reserve, but presumably this applies to any other central bank in any other country, is let the money supply grow by 3 to 5% a year. I think what he means by that is allow the money supply to grow as the economy grows. So prices are roughly unaffected. If the economy is growing at 3% a year, print 3% more dollars, everything else, so it's a wash, basically. You target, it's called GDP nominal targeting for you nerds, but the idea is the money supply is basically stable. The 3 to 5% a year is just to reflect growing productivity. I think that's an interesting way to run a central bank, if you wish to run a central bank. I wonder whether he's right about this, or whether actually those ideas have now been overtaken by new technology. I'm more of the Austrian school that I'm not totally sure I want the state to run my money supply. Now, that sounds crazy. Who will print the dollars? Who will print the pounds? Who will print the euros? Surely to God, one of the key things the state must do is to retain a money supply. I wonder whether that's actually the monetarism for which Friedman is famous might now be dying compared to 1962. That you could take your paycheck or a gift in sterling, but you can now immediately click two buttons and convert it into Bitcoin, gold, stock shares. If you've got one of these, you can convert it into anything at a transaction cost of nearly zero. No longer are we in a world when I was a young boy and my parents could afford a foreign holiday that we needed travelers' checks with a 10%, 20% transaction cost on them. That I wonder whether currency is actually now falling out of the hands of government, whether Friedman liked it or not. Were the state to run currency, I would like it to be run on Friedman lines, that you are just controlling the money supply to reflect the size of the economy. But I don't think that's what's occurred. And I think what we found is central banks, whether they are nationalized or whether they are independent, have all fallen into the easy trap, which is basically to print more as essentially it's a tax. It's essentially inflation, but people have got wise to it. There's one other thing that I should probably raise as well before I go over to any questions that you guys want to ask. And that goes to racism or the treatment of minorities in a market economy. Obviously, 1962 America, hugely different to 2025 America or 2025 Britain. I would go so far as to say I think 1962 America was pretty close in some parts to a South African apartheid system. However, what do we believe the solution to that problem should be? And he makes a very compelling argument that if you get the state out of the way, rather than having positive discrimination that, oh my God, we're terribly sorry about this. Now, every 3 out of 10 people must be ethnic minorities around the board table. The market economy will solve it. I think that's intriguing and almost certainly right. And if Friedman's insights here can become mainstream, that the best way to deal with racism is the market economy, then I think wokery is dead. And one of the big culture wars at the moment is the controlists, the left, who have sort of given up on economics, basically, but now think that every single conflict in life is like the old school Marxist conflict between worker and capitalist, but it's now between gay and straight, white and black. There's always an oppressor and a suppressed person. Friedman's insight into the market economy will not allow that to happen because it is colorblind. Now, I think his argument in that chapter is a bit 1962 America, possibly a little bit too simplistic, if I can say that, about one of our greatest Nobel Prize winners in economics, because I don't think the economy is colorblind, but I think it's nearly colorblind. It's possible there could be a restaurant in London in which white supremacist racists wouldn't turn up if they hired a black waiter. So don't want to go in there. They've got black waiters. I only want to be served by white people. It's possible there's a niche industry for that sort of slightly extraordinary racist behavior. But generally speaking, the wider economy is becoming anonymous. I literally don't know the color of the skin or the religion of the person who processes my tax return. I have no idea who they are. I pay a company to do that. I have no idea who packages up the things that I order from Deliveroo or get delivered from Amazon. So almost all of our interactions now, because of the wider market economy, a bigger, wider spider webs, are less face-to-face than they were in 1962. Therefore, racism, I think, even if it is a problem, is cancelled out even more than Friedman says in 1962, where you could imagine people boycotting particular restaurants or hotels, or various restaurants or hotels putting up, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish sort of signs. That is now almost certainly for the birds. So the market economy is the way to not do woke, but to beat woke. So this is a seminal text. I don't think it's right in every regard, but I think it changed thinking in the 80s, and I think it's powerful enough to change thinking again. That's my take on it, Hal. I hope that was a good intro.
Bravo, that was brilliant. And what a great summary of Capitalism and Freedom book. I am even embarrassed to show my copy because mine is even older than probably yours. And so I have the original publication.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a collector's item.
Yeah, I know.
I'll buy it off you on eBay.
So's Hal.
Please, if you have any questions regarding what you've heard, or particularly for this book, or any other stuff that he appeared on TV series, like he was in fact being commissioned by the PBS channel in America, which is equivalent of BBC. And now today he would have never had his opportunity, but then he used that media and he became really household name. I mean, Milton.
Yeah, but Hal, don't be too sorry. If Milton Friedman was alive today, he'd be earning £10 million a week by being on Fox News. So his opportunities are higher rather than lower.
That's correct. So, guys, yes, questions. Edith, I think your hand up there. Yes, go ahead.
Not mine, Simon's.
Oh, okay.
So, Mark, I was interested to hear what you said about money supply. I have always been of the view that the Bank of England should not be independent. They're not elected. We can't get rid of them. I think it should go back to politicians, but I think they should be very clear if we did that all they were looking at is M4. And if M4 goes up, you put up interest rates, and if M4 comes down, you put interest rates down. It seems to me that the whole money supply thing has got way too complicated. But I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I don't know whether to make an admission or to blow my own trumpet. My admission is that the only area that I was not good on in economics as a student was monetary policy. But it's partly because I consider it to be slightly farcical. I do consider the question about whether your target is M1, M2, M3, M4, or nominal GDP targeting a bit like trying to work out what tractor production should look like in Stalin's Russia. You could organize it for better or worse. There is a spectrum on who's making the tractors and where under some central planning. Central planning is going to fail, in my view, generally compared to the free market, but there's bad central planning, disastrous central planning, and catastrophic central planning. So why would we want to be in that space at all? I'm, thinking completely out of the box, and I appreciate this is not a political reality anytime soon, although it may be sooner than we think, closer to Friedrich Hayek on denationalized money. Why does the state need to run the money supply? And especially, as I was saying, on the transactions costs are now so low. So back in the day, 30, 40 years ago, right, we live in Britain, we're paid in sterling, we trade in sterling. I mean, everything's done by plastic now. So supposing you're paid in sterling, but you want to immediately switch it into Bitcoin or gold or dollars or euros or whatever the hell you want to, or shares in hair farms in Guatemala. Why do we want there to be a nationalized monopoly on the printing of a currency? I think it's the position of last resort. So you need a court that could adjudicate. Sam, if you and I have a fight and it turns out I owe you X, it needs to be measured in some currency or other. Is it gold? Is it sterling? Is it how many sheep I owe you? So it needs to be a last resort. But the idea this is now part of the economic system, that how many banknotes Andrew Bailey chooses to print is, and quantitative easing has been a catastrophe in my view, right? And the bank is not held to account. So even if they miss their targets, they're never fired. Politicians are fired for missing their targets in a democracy. Bureaucrats and central bankers never are, even if they bring about an economic collapse. Couldn't we just get that roughly out of politics altogether? If you want a baseline trading system for the resolution of disputes in a court of law in England, it will be sterling. But why do we need to do anything else about it? But what other function does it serve? You can hold your money anywhere at the flick of anything, and not just in money, in stock, shares, cryptocurrency, whatever you want. So I just wonder whether actually Hayek will be proven right on denationalization of money, rather than Friedman talking about, if you're going to have a central bank, this is how I'd organize it. I agree with Friedman that if you're going to have a central bank, this is how I'd organize it. But then this would be like Friedman advising Joe Stalin about, if you're going to have centralized tractor production, this is how I would organize it. Okay, well, maybe you can make it centralized tractor production rather more efficient than it was, but you'll never make it more efficient than a market in tractor production would be. So I'm not really, to that extent, a monetarist. I accept that monetarism is the best way of organizing currency in a statist world. But do we really need a governor of the bank? I also agree with you that if we're going to do it, we may as well nationalize it. It's a political decision. It's not a technical piece of expertise. But I think I lean much more on the radical side, which is to say it's a baseline currency upon which we'll resolve disputes. So if you and I are fighting in dollars or Bitcoin or gold, and we go to court, the dispute will be resolved in whatever the price is in sterling, but probably won't be, shouldn't be, and increasingly isn't the mechanism of exchange. That could be something completely different. I'll buy my Tesco's groceries in gold, and then I'll go down the restaurant and play in Bitcoin, and then I'll book my foreign holiday in US dollars. So we've got now the environment that Hayek predicted, the Austrian school rather than the Chicago school. Now, so I'm not trying to diminish Friedman here. If you want the state to run the money supply, probably run it like Friedman. But that, to my mind, is, if you want the state to run the food supply, the advice to Joe Stalin would be X, Y, or Z. Well, I don't want the state to do it. And I think we now actually have the opportunity in front of us. Indeed, it's happening before our eyes, that people are just opting out of the state money supply because it's a joke. So I don't necessarily disagree with you on M4 targeting. Perhaps do that. But I almost don't care about the dartboard you're throwing darts at, if that makes sense. I prefer us to just have, that as the baseline currency, rather than trying to work out how to organize a currency through socialist means.
You may not have seen it, but Giles has written something. Giles, can you read that out, or?
Yeah, happy to. Question I put in the chat is, how is the concept of economic freedom as a prerequisite for political freedom constrained, perhaps even threatened, by lawyers and judicial decisions?
Yeah, well, quite a bit, but I think you may have got the cart and the horse the wrong way round here, right? So Friedman, I'm not saying he's going all the way back to Hobbes or Locke in the way that he looks at it. Economic freedom is not a guarantee of political freedom. And I wonder what Milton Friedman would have made of, he would have seen some of it, but not much of it, but the emergence of Singapore, China, for example, countries that I would say have incredibly limited political freedom, but increasing economic freedom. It's a prerequisite economic freedom. It's neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for political freedom. So you can have economic freedom and a suppressive state, but economic freedom doesn't guarantee it. What you can't have is a suppressive economic state and political freedom. Prerequisite, not guarantor, not an absolute causal effect to guarantee that we'll have freedom, but a necessary plank. Now, what we've now got, I'm taking from Charles's, I'm inferring, but Charles, correct me if I'm wrong. The problem we've got now is all of the lawyers and judicial decisions are part of the state apparatus, right? These are now interfering with economic freedoms. We now have courts in the United Kingdom determining whether or not you can have a license to drill in the North Sea. I mean, this is ludicrous. That clearly shouldn't be a judicial decision. We have judges and courts pronouncing upon what a clothing store like Next should be paying their people who work in warehouses compared to the people who work on the shop floor. Their decision with regard to gender pay gaps has bankrupted Birmingham City Council because a court decided that something similar, that the women who work on the shop floor should be paid the same as the men who work in a warehouse. Why are courts making these sort of decisions? We've abandoned the market concept. I'd also argue that the gender pay gap is basically a myth. There is a gender pay gap, but it's not explained by misogyny. It's explained by lifestyle preferences and career preferences being different between men and women as an average. If a woman never has kids and never takes time off, her earning potential is exactly the same as a man. But many women, obviously, at a time in which their careers may well be on an upward trajectory, take time off. But all of this is now run by the courts. Now, I take that as the state. The state is now deciding who can drill where, what Next, Asda and other companies can pay to their male or female staff. That is a statist operation. It's done under the cloak of human rights and the Equality Act. But this is courts deciding economic decisions, not a democratic government. So to Charles's point, I hope I've answered it, but I may have missed part of the sting of it. The lawyers and the judicial decisions are part of the socialist state. They're part of the interventionist state. We have given them the tools and the means to adjudicate on these things. And if you give somebody the tools and the means to adjudicate on warehouse workers against shop floor workers, you give anybody any power, they're going to use it. And we've transferred too much of that power to the judiciary, thereby making it political. And I want to get the judiciary back to, and the state in general, to smaller, more confined and better. That your judgment should actually be guilty or innocent. Sometimes that's decided by a jury, and the appropriate penalty. Not to interpret whether BP can drill in the North Sea or whether that's a breach of your human rights. So I take the whole judicial function. Again, I don't want to overplay this. The UK is not the Soviet Union by any manner or means, but there is a comparison of near kangaroo courts that have basically become political rather than judicial. And I think we need to get back completely to the separation of powers and to understand what political decisions are and where they should be taken, in my view, in Parliament, and what judicial decisions are, which is a judgment about how you've acted within the law and what your punishment should be. Unfortunately, we've politicized the law. And I'm afraid that oppressive societies, whether socialist or fascist, always go that way. The rule of law has now in Britain, to some degree, become the rule of lawyers. That it's no longer the execution of what Parliament has decided on a level playing field with a fair ref. The referee is a pseudo-politician. So we need to somehow extract that out. I think that's a great sort of reset. We need to reset the British Constitution to about where it was in 1992, and we can solve it.
Thank you for that. Anybody? All right. Tony first, I think, if I
Mark,
and Stuart next. But
Mark, I found your summary of the 4 key points very interesting, and I had a question on all of them. However, I'm going to pick one out.
well done.
That he wasn't in favour of licensing of professions, because this is an interesting one. I can understand licensing is when he says a racket, it is misused. Being an engineer all my life, not I mean, I was trained as an engineer, and then I moved into like projects and so on. But at the end of the day, the term engineer has never been understood by the public in this country. We have technical engineers, guys that are really brilliant in dealing with their hands. Guy Martin's one of those, the guy from brilliant. But there are professional engineers who have a very long training of service, not just in technically, academically, but in practical and experience of doing the job for life. Now, the term engineer is misinterpreted because nobody knows the difference between the two, or they don't seem to. And I'm not advocating licensing, but there must be a recognition somewhere of control over whether somebody is really qualified academically to do something, rather than anybody with just half the knowledge to do it.
Well, is that right? I mean, it's really difficult. Tony, thanks for the question. And, I'm not an engineer at all. The leader of the Conservative Party in Britain claims to be an engineer. And I don't know what license she has.
Yeah, precisely. That's a pure example.
But I mean, forgive me saying this, because I don't mean to poo-poo your question. It's important, and it goes to a whole range of professions. Does it matter? So let me give you a counterexample, something I know a little about, not a lot about, which is the construction of amusement parks in America, particularly in Florida. They now describe the people who build these amusement parks as Imagineers, right? It's obviously not a licensed profession, but how do I create the greatest haunted house ride ever? How do I create the greatest Dolls ride ever? How do I create a Dumbo the Elephant experience or some such? They're called Imagineers, right? Now, obviously, it requires engineering, CGI, architecture, all of these sort of things. It's not a licensed profession. So why would you need a license to be an engineer? Obviously, if I needed to hire an engineer for something, if I wanted to build a massive bridge between Scotland and Northern Ireland, a 200 billion pound project, or if in my foolish moments I wanted to build HS2, a train line from London to Birmingham to compete with the presently perfectly good train line between London and Birmingham. But let's just say you want to do this sort of thing. What sort of people would you hire for this?
The qualified people who are able to design those facilities and make sure they don't fail.
That's absolutely right. Of course, you would look for those. Why are you worried that the market wouldn't provide that certification? So why would I be limited to only hiring people who have a state qualification in engineering? Why can't it just be a kite mark, right? So
I agree.
I would take the kite mark seriously. I mean, you would be a crazy person to design a roller coaster at Disney World because somebody had sent you a sketch. You would be mad to have brain surgery done on you by somebody who says, I've got a scalpel, I think I know what I'm doing. I've watched a few medical documentaries. Why does the state need to authenticate that? Why can't we just kite mark that? And I think people would, as I was saying about the AA and the RAC auditing hotels, or TripAdvisor as it now does so, that's your kite mark. So if you're an engineer, that's great. Send me your CV. You've got 27 years of experience. You're particularly good at bridges. You're not so good at underpasses. I'm looking for people like you. Why does it need to be licensed by the state? And you'll notice that the professions that are not licensed by the state seem to be growing faster, right? You don't need to be licensed by the state to be a coder for Elon Musk, right? There's no license required for that. You don't need to be licensed by the state to set up a media platform. You don't need to be licensed by the state to write cinema or theatre. No license is required for this. So why would we have a license for these particular things? Your work and your experience should speak for itself. I have no license in the job I do. I mean, I'm sort of half an economist, but I can't really claim to be an economist. I've run organizations that are involved in the political economy. I don't get a license from the state to appear on this Zoom call to be particularly informed about what I'm saying. You take me at face value. I can provide you with my CV. I've got certificates from private institutions and recommendations that I think would, I hope, give you confidence that I'm qualified. But the idea that there is someone who can determine whether you, Tony, are an acceptable engineer or not, some engineering board or qualification, I'm highly skeptical about. Now, that doesn't mean I want idiots building bridges. It means that I think the market will work out the expertise better than a licensing agency.
Mm-hmm.
And the minute you bring in the licensing agency, you get a closed shop. One of the disasters in healthcare has been exactly that in Britain, that once you've got a number of brain surgeons who are licensed, they are incentivized to have fewer brain surgeons coming on stream, right? Because there's this amount of brain surgery that needs done, and if they can stop supply, they will make more price because of demand. So I'm all in favor of licensing, but I want AARAC TripAdvisor licensing, not state regulator licensing.
Yeah,
and I believe that will actually recognize talent better than the state provider. It's what Hayek said. Sorry to go back to Hayek when we're supposed to be talking about freedom. The fatal conceit. Hayek describes the fatal conceit as being, this doesn't work brilliantly, therefore I can design a system that will work perfectly. So, and that is the route to hell, right? So there will be a story somewhere of someone who pretended to be a brain surgeon, conducted brain surgery, didn't know what they were doing, hundreds of patients died. That is a disaster, a catastrophe. That person should go to prison for life. But the idea that the solution to that is that we can have perfect insight to run a brain surgeon regulator that will make sure that never happens again is the fatal conceit. The way of exchanging information about people's expertise, their qualifications, their fitness to do a job is not the license given by the state. It's the reputation given by the market.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you. I'm going to get Stuart and other questions very, very quickly, but I have to interject here about the Milton Friedman world at the time, and it still is the same in America. If you go to a hairdresser has to be licensed.
Yeah.
And you see the license presented, they're paying like 150 to 200 dollars to the state.
Yeah.
Sometimes they pay that to the city and then the state. If you're a lawnmower cutting lawns, you have to have a license in America. You cannot operate without a license and cut my lawn. So this is really heavily burdening America much more than us. I mean, because we have these professional organizations like accountancy organizations, and you're a certified accountant, or you are this accountant, that accountant, so you can join these associations places. But in America, you have to have a license, city license, state license. And even DeSantis, all these years that he is in power, he still haven't eliminated those licenses.
Hal, can I just add a statistic to this, which I'm slightly pulling from memory, so I can't say that this is entirely peer-reviewed, but it was about 3 years ago, so it may have changed, but I suspect it was not changed by much. 3 or 4 years ago, 28% of all jobs in the UK labour market required you to have a license to practice legally, whether brain surgeon or hairdresser or whatever. 28% of all jobs in the labour market required you to be licensed by the state, compared to in France, a country that we take the mick out of for being a regulated socialist economy. 20% of the workforce required a license. So we were over licensed compared to the French.
Why? Okay. Stuart, where are you?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Very interesting. Just a quick observation. How would you think, as the world has moved on, that Friedman's position would be? You used the analogy of the AA and the RAC regulating of hotels, 1 to 4 star, 1 to 5 star, whatever, compared to, say, TripAdvisor or Trustpilot or whatever. But the reality of it is, in many ways, I would see the globalists and the big corporations are now actually taking over the role of the state in many aspects. I'll give you an example. You mentioned TripAdvisor and these kind of people, Trustpilot. Well, they're an unreliable source of information. I mean, these reviews, for example, you can buy them from India for £1 each. You have to buy a minimum of 400 reviews, and you get them popped onto your website, and that costs you £400. Well, in reality, how do you see the role of the big globalist organizations? You mentioned Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin basically is an unregulated currency. You can trade it all over the world. You can move it here. You can move it there. Implications on tax, etc., are favorable. So I think in many respects, the fundamentals remain, but the world has moved on. How do you see the Friedman thinking in the 21st century with information technology where it is now? You mentioned I mean, everybody's paying with Apple Pay. Well, the key to that is information. Information is power. Information is dollars or pounds. How do you see that?
I see that. Thanks, Stuart. It's a fascinating thing because I think it's what's changed the world, actually. And I'll try and answer your question directly, but then I want to come back to a really interesting thing that Matt Ridley said. What's changed enormously is the state can no longer control information flows. It's all right. You can block certain websites. You can throw people into prison for saying something untoward on Facebook about Muslims or something. You can do that at the margins. By the way, they shouldn't. It's horrific. But they've totally lost control of it, right? And we now essentially have an argument in modern Western society very similar to the argument that we had in English Victorian society about the penny dreadfuls. About, oh my God, is all of this information, how dare it? Or even going back further about the printing press and whether there were going to be too many Bibles. That's what Christians worried about. Oh my God, suddenly it's not going to be Bibles that are handed by a monk. So, say again?
Too many Qurans now.
Too many Qurans. Well, hang on. You might not like the particular book.
No.
My point is, it's now mass production. The Quran is now competing with the Bible. Now, in terms of information technology, what's happening here, which I'm encouraged by, but it is chaotic, is barriers to entry are collapsing, right? So one of my favorite headlines ever, you could probably Google it even now, was from The Guardian about 12 years ago, something like that, might have been 15 years ago, saying Friends Reunited is now a social media monopoly and nothing will stop it. Friends Reunited doesn't exist anymore. Right? It is over. Its market value is naught. I can't remember who bought it, but it's done. So on information, it now flows so freely that you don't need an interlocutor. And this is what's sending society mad. What are we going to do about misinformation on Twitter about COVID vaccines? What are we going to do about racism on Facebook? There is no interlocutor. The legacy media are, in consequence, dead, really. that the job back in the day of the BBC, I'm not particularly picking on them, or CNN or ITV, would be to take the information and try and be the interlocutor between the high ups who had the information and the audience at home who were sitting on their sofa waiting to receive it. That model of information flow has completely gone. It's completely gone. Everyone is now a citizen journalist. Everyone. You literally only, well, not everyone. I mean, you basically need one of these, right? But they're very, 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 very cheap. This completely changes information and barriers to entry. Joe Rogan, who in my view is a pretty good presenter, it's not particularly to my taste, would have been an impossible phenomenon in the old information technology model. But suddenly, 150 million people can find him. So we break it down, right? That we don't need to worry about this. It's impossible to stop it. Lies will, Winston Churchill said, a lie will go, twice, 3 times around the world before the truth has got its boots on. That might have been true back then. It's not true now, actually. The truth goes around the world 3 times faster than a lie's got its boot on. Everything's contestable. Everything's contestable. But information flows are unbelievable. Now, I did want to say I'd say something about Matt Ridley, because if there's another book you should look at, and I think it is the favorite non-fiction book I've ever read, it is Matt Ridley's The Rational Optimist. It's an incredible insight into how the world has changed. Please read it, because it's the greatest antidote to despair and disaster and all of the rest of it. Basically, the world is going to keep getting better, and it always has since the dawn of man. And here's the proof. But there's a particular interesting insight, which goes, Stuart, to your point about information technology, is we often think that the world is just sort of roughly, okay, it might be slightly desperate times at the moment, but generally speaking, the world moves forward, right? Every 30, 40 years, we'll be better at healthcare, we'll be better at transport, we'll be better at computers, movies will get better, clothing will get better, white wine will get better. We're just generally sort of moving on and progressing. Ridley has a really interesting insight, which is that ideas and entrepreneurialism doesn't work quite like that. What you actually get are huge leaps forward in one sector and incredibly snail-like progress or none in another. And the example he gave, I think Matt's a little older than me, but let's say he's 60 for sake of argument, was that his grandparents' generation would have seen a massive change in food supply, that suddenly it was no longer, oh, the butcher's out of money or whatever. Agriculture improved. His parents' generation would have seen, and this was the one that really caught my attention, because my father used to work for British Airways. So my parents' generation, people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, hundreds, or those deceased from that generation, total transformation in transport. Unbelievable. I mean, almost in 2 generations, we'd gone from the cart and horse to Concorde. I mean, almost in 2 generations. It's unbelievable. From Henry Ford to supersonic travel, and flying around the world within the reach of the ordinary person. Transport is put a man on the moon. Transport is the incredible advance from, let's say, 1920 to 1970. Unbelievable. Sherlock Holmes would not have recognized it. The idea that Sherlock Holmes would call an Uber. I mean, we were moving by horseback. And suddenly, 50 years later, 60, 70 years later, we're putting a man on the moon. And we can travel at faster than the speed of sound. What an advance. Would have been considered unbelievable. Now, let's pause there. About 1970, I was born in 1972, but let's pause there. Over my lifetime, over the last 50 years, almost no advance in transport. I mean, it has been some. Cars are safer. with no doubt sort of slightly modified safety in airplanes, but basically transport hasn't really advanced in the last 50 years. The railway I get on, the airplane I get on, the car I get in, whilst modified and a little bit better, is very, very close to what my father would have been using a generation ago. What has changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years is communications. It's gone beyond belief. I mean, I can remember as a boy, I mean, I'm trying to think back to my university days when I was 18, 19, 20. How the hell did I communicate with people? How did I agree to meet with a bunch of friends in a pub of an evening? I mean, I didn't have email. I didn't have a phone. I mean, I'm trying to piece back together how the hell I put this back together. If people wanted to communicate with me, they had to send me a letter. And they had to make a decision about whether to send it first class or second class. If I wanted to speak to my parents, I had to queue up in a phone booth and put a 10p coin into a machine to have 2 minutes. 30 years later, unbelievable. Wherever my parents are in the world, wherever you guys are in the world, I can communicate with them. Transport hasn't changed. Communications has changed beyond belief. The idea, I mean, I can still remember 30 years ago, you know, if you wish to receive something, please send a stamped, addressed envelope. I mean, they're gone, right? That disappeared, completely transformed and changed, and it's free. Basically, it's free. What a transformation. Transport hasn't moved on. Communications is the story of the last generation. What will be the story of the next? We don't know. But it's unlikely that everything of human interest will move forward incrementally. I suspect it will be medicine, that AI will utterly transform health. Again, no major advances over the last generation or two. Certainly improve things. Don't get me wrong, you can improve things at the margin. Healthcare is now better than it was 30 years ago. But there hasn't been a cure for cancer. Imagine. There hasn't been nanotechnology. There will be so we actually do bursts in various different sectors of human development. The burst of transport is just sensational, from the horse and cart to putting a man on the moon is about 40 years really, but we haven't put a man on the moon basically since, and transport, although nicer and faster and a little bit better, hasn't really changed. Communications have changed. I mean, my grandparents, both deceased, but I mean, would not believe this sort of stuff. My parents can barely believe this sort of stuff. It's almost incredible how we can communicate. And the next step forward will be, I think, something else. Best guess, medicine. That healthcare will just transform. The cost will fall to, we'll find a cure for cancer, something like that.
Well, if you haven't read the little note Mr. Nigel Legg has put down, he says, the medical profession is a classic example of licensing. Soon you will need a license to cut toenails. Well, yes.
Yeah.
Nigel, you are right, sir. I'm going to wrap up, but unless somebody didn't ask questions, a question. Okay. Mark, the only word we haven't used in the whole of this program, and where he has been most right, I think, was the word inflation. I think he was spot on. He is the one who coined the term Congress made inflation, not, anything else. Parliament makes inflation. What I'm trying to say is, when I asked my MP, when he blamed the Putin and people like that for the inflation, I asked, how come then Japanese only have 2% inflation while they are importing every single energy that they use?
Yeah.
So I think Milton Friedman was spot on, and I'm going to advise my friends to watch those videos available about inflation. I think he's spot on, and he.
How can I just? There's a wider point. I agree with you. Look, I mean, you know,
No,
it's a very simple equation. You know, if you print more dollars, the value of each dollar will fall. Ceteris paribus, all things being equal. I mean, it's not a particularly remarkable insight, right? And you know, I've got, you know, somewhere in the back of my flat a $1 trillion Zimbabwean note that was initially a $1 Zimbabwean note. You just print zeros on it. It seems to me that's true, but not obviously prescriptive. I mean, what do we make of that? I mean, if you print more banknotes, there's more banknotes chasing the same number of scarce resources, so prices will go up. So what? Should we make sure that prices don't go up, or should we make sure that fiat currency doesn't matter anymore? So why would we worry about the value of a pound? Over my lifetime, the purchasing power of a pound has fallen 85%, right? This is a catastrophe if you put it in stocks and shares. In my father's lifetime, the purchasing power of a pound has fallen by 98%. Get out of pounds, right? If you're forcibly paid in pound sterling, immediately transfer it into some other asset. So let's render the pound sterling merely a medium of exchange, not a store of value. And if that happens, then I don't really care whether you print noughts on the banknote, because within 1 second of me receiving my paycheck, I'm transferring it into something else. Now, that was not an opportunity in 1962, right? That didn't really exist as an option. You could technically do it. I've got a whole load of dollars. I want to get them into Argentinian pesos. I've got a whole load of Argentinian pesos. I want to get them to dollars. I've got a whole load of sterling. God damn it, there's exchange controls. Now, flick of the switch. So I think that the sort of public message, I mean, it can inform public policy or not, is get out of fiat currency. As soon as you get your paycheck, think, do I want to hold this in sterling, or do I want to immediately switch it into something else of value? And it's the information technology that's allowed us to do that. To that end, I don't really care about monetary policy. Why do I care if inflation's 1,000,000%? Inflation's 1,000,000%, but I'm in gold and Bitcoin every day I get paid, and I'm beating sterling. So, I mean, I'm genuinely interested in answers to that point. I mean, and I appreciate it hit the poor and those who aren't able to, only use cash or whatever. But as a general proposition, who cares? It doesn't
in that
matter.
case, do you think Milei in Argentina is going to be successful changing it to dollarization rather than pesos or whatever they use there?
Well, it's what he correctly spotted was you're forcing people to use Argentinian pesos, right? So they had exchange controls that you couldn't move out of Argentinian pesos, right? There were limits on how many pesos you could change into dollars, right? There are no such limits in the UK. He's released those limits, making the Argentinian peso a competitive but joke currency on the market. So obviously, if you want to go full North Korea, you can. We could have a rule in Britain that you could only exchange in sterling. You can only take £100 abroad, because anything else than that would be a luxurious holiday. If you want to exchange more than £1 million, you need the permission of the Bank of England. We could bring back all of those sorts of rules. Or we could say, look, it's our baseline currency, but we don't really care about it, actually. And our strong advice is that, you should decide whether you want to be in sterling every time you got money in your back pocket or not. Cash is clearly basically over, right? Going back to Stuart's point, I don't know what M1 is now. It must be absolutely tiny. I mean, I can't remember the last time I had more than £20 in my wallet. I basically keep a £20 note in my wallet. 6 months later, I realised I still haven't used it. So all of this allows us, I think, to swerve some of Milton Friedman's concern about the money supply. It doesn't mean that we should deliberately print €6 on every £10 note and declare everybody in Britain a billionaire. But it does mean that it's less relevant now, because the money supply of each nation state is increasingly not the monopoly provider of things that we associate with money supply, like the store of value, like the medium of exchange. Those have just been borne away at. So if you want to go and print 10 noughts on every sterling banknote, I think that's foolish, but I can hedge against you as a British guy who's paid in sterling. So I just wonder whether monetarism is now outdated, thanks to technologies breaking in, like Bitcoin, like the ability that you can buy and sell gold, stocks and shares in a second, as long as you've got an iPhone.
Interesting. Well, I will. It has to be a quick question and a quick answer, because we really have to wrap it up now.
Yeah, just in the only issue I have with your theory there, Mark, is that if you transfer it straight into gold or dollars or whatever, you know, those are volatile currencies, and if you need to, well, I agree, but if you need to use it to buy things in this country because you can't buy, you know, you're shopping at Tesco's in dollars, then you've got to transfer it back, and it seems to me that, you know, nice idea, but I think
No. Sorry, is it Sam? Sorry,
Simon.
I'm sorry. Edith, I'm glad to see Edith's in control.
Well, Edith
There's a name on the Zoom call. So Edith's other half. Simon, you're sort of right. My point is the transaction cost of doing that is falling to zero. So speak to Steve Baker, former Conservative MP for Wickham. He holds 46 currencies on his phone. Tesco's don't know about this. As he gets to the checkout, he pays in sterling. His phone works out the best exchange rate at that second to pay Tesco's in sterling. Right? So he's got gold, he's got pesos, he's got dollars, he's got Bitcoin, he's got the lot. 48 currencies, I think. Fucking euros, the whole enchilada. Tesco's are insistent on sterling. He doesn't even need to do the calculation. He has something called, I can't remember what the app is, you know, Exchange for Me, that just puts his phone on. And it is paid not by him necessarily in sterling, might be paid by him in sterling, is paid by him from his Bitcoin account, his Euro account, his dollar account, his Canadian dollar account, his US dollar account, his stocks and shares account, his Bitcoin account. Whatever the AI has worked out is the best way to pay sterling at the second that Tesco give you the bill. So Tesco's are only willing to accept sterling. That's the way I'll pay. What's the problem for Steve Baker?
Well, the volatility of currencies and the volatility of...
Well, it's not his problem. Sterling's just halved.
Yeah.
his shopping bill's just halved.
Yeah.
I mean, why Sterling? I mean, what's the problem? I mean, there's a volatility on currency that he's completely hedged. Tesco's wants sterling. He's hedged across 46 currencies. What's the problem?
I mean, it's amazing.
It's like saying, you know, I've got stocks and shares in Microsoft. What do I do if that goes down? Well, you know, I hope you got some shares in Rolls-Royce and British American Tobacco. It is now so easy to do that. Now, I'm not quite as wired up as Steve, but it's literally, he says, you know, the phone works out which currency he has paid in because Tesco's are determined to take sterling. That strikes me as a problem for Tesco, not a problem for the customer.
Wow. I think definitely things have changed. I mean, in hedging used to be just for the institutions, but now individuals, you're saying, that can hedge against currencies.
Yeah.
Guys, I don't know you, but I really thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, it was good for me to reread Milton Friedman again, I have to say. And I'm glad you read it as well, Mark. And polished
it's a fantastic text. I mean, it really, and a racy read.
Yeah, he is good. I think we had a bit of insight of things that are happening around us as well. I hope you will all agree with that, and I knew you were going to enjoy it, but I'm going to find out later on from each and every one of you later. But thank you so much, Mark. and you really I know I'm terrible to introduce people. I should have done it from the beginning, but there, David Hills, he didn't say anything, but I'll tell you, he's the chairman of Liz Truss. So
Used to be.
used to be, yes.
Yeah. Mark and I have wandered the streets in southwest Norfolk. So
all right, there you go. You did good. I'm glad Liz managed to pull Mark all the way from London, but she did manage that. Okay. Yeah. So Mark, I mean, good luck for what you're doing. We're all, I think Stuart once sent me text and links from Popular Conservatism. I have joined Popular Conservatism at the very, very beginning.
Yep.
But I don't know, something has happened, and I complained to Liz as well about the communications. So hopefully we'll sort that out. And we support you for what you do, Mark, and you are a really great guy. So thank you again.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Hal.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.